Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. Here in the France 24 debate, we're asking what happened to flight MH370. We're talking about it with John CLEMES, who lost a brother in the 2009 Rio-Paris flight that crashed in the South Atlantic. We're also speaking with Antoine, BONDAZ, visiting scholar at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center from Washington. Jim Matthews, executive editor of the Aviation Week Intelligence Network, and Pierre DUVAL, chair of the Regulation and Safety Committee at the Aéroclub de France. Welcome back to all you gentlemen. Jim Matthews, how and why would a commercial airliner, a Boeing 777 with a near flawless record over many years, turn around and go the wrong way without anyone noticing?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why you might want to turn an airplane around. Some kind of in-flight emergency is the easy and obvious answer. If you are close enough as the pilot in command, you might make the decision, I need to go back. If they were diverted for some other reason, you might change the flight path. If they got confused and were looking for a different waypoint, they may have mistrusted what they were seeing. And you'll notice that all of my answers so far have used the words may, or possibly, or could. And the fact is that there's 20 or 30 different ways that you could play this out, and any one of them would make a certain amount of sense. We don't really know why they made the decision that they made. We don't really know what circumstances led to them making that abrupt turn. And we don't really know what happened to disable the ACARs, for example. We know they were disabled. We don't know who did it. We presume that it was somebody in the flight crew, but nobody really knows that. So at every step of the way, you can start to make presumptions and then find 10 reasons why they may not be the case. So what we really know for sure is that this airplane started out heading for Beijing and then abruptly turned and then followed along a path that's been in some dispute, but the satellite data that's just come out suggests that that path ended in the South Indian Ocean, and that's where the searchers are going to concentrate their efforts. That's what we actually know. Everything else is plausible, reasonable, interesting, and will probably guide the searchers in assessing where they should look next. But that's all it is scenarios and guesswork.
All right, just a couple of the scenarios and a little bit of the guesswork here. Could the plane's electronics have been hacked?
I've heard that theory. I'm not an engineer. I'm not going to sit here and say that I know definitively that it could not have been hacked. There was a special bulletin that was put out to secure the onboard systems from that kind of a cyber attack, but that was put out before this incident. So I don't know if this particular aircraft had complied with that bulletin at that point. Sure, it's one of 20 scenarios that have been put out there, and as I said, I'm not an engineer, so I can't really say. But certainly it was plausible enough that FAA went ahead and went out with a blessing for a service bulletin to cover that as a possibility.
What's your gut feeling?
You know, I've been asked that before, and I honestly don't have one. And maybe it's because I've spent a lot of time both as an aircrew member in search missions and as an air search planner. You play out scenarios, and most of the time it turns out to be the one you didn't think it was going to be. That has taught me over the years not to discount any possibility until you find definitive physical proof.
Pierre DUVAL, what do you see right now with, I guess we don't have very much more information than we did the last time we spoke, which was nearly 2 weeks ago, but what do you see as the most likely scenario at this point?
I don't have a most likely scenario. As has been said just now, you know, you can imagine so many things, and then the real stuff is always something different. Hacking such a system is a very, very big job. And one thing would which would amaze me, would be that you can hack that in one time, in 1 second, avoiding any kind of communication, taking full control of the airplane without the crew being able to do anything. This would highly surprise me. But why not? But I heard so many things, I read so many things these last days regarding ET, regarding, so many theories. This one is not on top of mind.
We have a question. I'll put it to you, Jim Matthews. What are the odds the pilots were incapacitated and the plane was flying on autopilot?
It's certainly plausible. We talk a lot about the time of useful consciousness when you reach certain altitudes, and we do know that this airplane made some pitch ups and got to some fairly high altitudes. If there was some kind of depressurization event and the pilots were incapacitated, the airplane might well just have flown on until it couldn't. That's what we saw in the crash that claimed the life of Payne Stewart in a business jet many years ago. It's plausible. It does happen. The oxygen systems that are available to pilots and actually the ones that drop down over your head as a passenger, they produce oxygen for some period of time, but not 7 hours. So that is a possibility. But as I said, I could tell you another 15 things that are also possibilities. Any one of them are plausible. We won't really know until we recover physical evidence from the airplane and ideally the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Those two boxes will really have all the answers.
Jim, also the last words of the pilot saying good night to air traffic controllers, that's been deconstructed. Some say it's not standard procedure. Are we making too much of that?
I will say I think we're making a lot too much of that. Almost any time you hand off from one controller to another, you will say your call sign, and then you'll say good day, or so long, or good night, or thank you. So it didn't strike me as the least bit unusual to use that terminology. Flight so-and-so, good night. Very common.
Pierre DUVAL?
I fully agree with that. When you are in a cockpit, it's human to human person speaking. So you say hello, you say good night. When you are not in a high density traffic and you have time to say so, why not being just human and saying hello and good night? That's normal. This has nothing to do with any kind of out of procedure. And the guy was just as any other pilot.
John, Jim Matthews, I suspect that over the past 17 days you've been combing over the history books. Is there a precedent of any kind?
I think the closest one really is the Air France crash. And as we've sort of explored this evening, there are a lot of things about that incident, the way this was handled, that are not akin to what we're seeing here today. But certainly that was fairly mysterious for quite some time. It took a very long time to find any kind of evidence about what was going on. So there are some similarities. I think what's different here is probably the degree of attention, the scale of the search. We were talking about searching a third of the globe for several days before we could narrow this search box down. That's an enormous search. So to that degree, I think it was unprecedented. There are elements of this that, as I said, I mentioned the Payne Stewart crash earlier. If it turns out that this was a depressurization event, then yes, there will be some historical precedent there that we can apply to this. But I think this case is unique in the scale of the effort, the political complications, and just the difficulty ascertaining that last known point from which to begin the search. We've waited 2 weeks to really start the search in a serious way, and that to me is kind of unprecedented.
John, when you think back to when that plane went down, June the 1st, 2009, how long did it take before you could say to yourself, all right, I know what happened to my brother?
Well, I was fairly sure immediately. given that it just seemed inconceivable that a plane of that size could disappear without any sign and without any messages, without any trace. But I guess for many of the families, the definitive proof probably came when we started to find the debris after 5 days. So we had to wait 5 days. We knew there were mechanical problems already, and then when we saw the debris, mechanical problems, debris, it was pretty obvious what had happened.
5 days, and then how long did it take really before you felt as though I really know what happened?
Well, it took 3 years to have the story. We started to find debris after 5 days, but the first 3 search phases for the plane failed, and we didn't find the plane until 23 months after the accident. And then it took about another year for them to raise the black boxes, analyze them, and publish the report and come out with their definitive conclusions. So it was an extremely long process.
I know that one of the recommendations from that was to perhaps update the way black boxes are made. Apparently it hasn't been done yet.
I'm not an expert in those areas. I know that the BEA made, the French Civil Investigation Authority, made a number of recommendations to try to improve safety in these areas. I don't, to the best of my knowledge, very few of them, if any, have actually been implemented. It's a world problem. It's not a French problem. It's something that has to be done with the level of the world authorities, and my colleagues here tonight would know better that question than I would, I think. But yeah, very little has actually been followed up on, I think.
Pierre, it's often said that, taking a plane is a lot more safer than driving a car. Do you think that the lessons of 2009 have been learned?
Oh, yes. Yes, because we are now really in the wake of something horrible, but this is something very, very rare. I know that when you are part of it, this is a real hard thing. But, when you consider the number of flights and the improvement of safety in the last years, that's only statistic. And statistic is always horrible because when you are part of a statistic, it's always bad. But, traveling by plane is okay. Something which is still, if you want to go from point A to B, something which is relatively safe. And the measures which were taken after the Air France crash, one of them may be useful today because it's the duration of emission from the black boxes underwater. So we know that we have at least 30 days of duration for the batteries, and for the coming 2 weeks, maybe more, the researchers, the crews, should be able to listen to it and to find it. So fingers crossed, but we may have something in the coming 2 weeks.
And Jim Matthews, is the needle in a haystack analogy the right one?
I think it is, although I would have said that 2 weeks ago what we were looking at was a haystack about a third of the globe. So to some extent you were looking to find the haystack before you could even start the search for the needle. And now we're at the point where we know where the haystack is and we're starting to pull the hay apart. And honestly, that is a tremendous advance in this search. As was just mentioned earlier, we now have a longer battery life in the boxes. This gives us another 2 weeks or so, depending on the conditions of the equipment, to conduct this search. And there's been fairly good statistical work done on where you find wreckage relative to the last known point. And it's a fairly narrow area. And that will really aid the search going forward once the weather improves and some of the physical conditions improve to make that search possible.
All right, I want to talk a little bit more, Antoine BONDAZ, about the politics of it all. Now, just to remind viewers, last year, China's president visited Malaysia. It was hailed as a new beginning for bilateral ties. Then, though, in January, Chinese patrol ships showing up in the James Shoal, that's in the South China Sea, about 80 kilometers off Borneo Island, an area which Beijing counts as the southernmost part of its territory. And as you know, before touching down here in France after that summit in The Hague, Xi Jinping rubbing elbows with his Japanese, South Korean counterparts. Disputed islands in the East China Sea were no doubt on the menu in the corridors of that summit. Disputes, as we see, which extend further south. And by the way, it's not just China and Malaysia. Could this horrible event in some way help to overcome these differences?
I think it won't. I think it's completely not related with the territorial dispute. And there is something else to say, that the territorial dispute actually with Malaysia is not the biggest one. It's nothing compared to the dispute with Vietnam, the Philippines, or Japan. Actually, with the three main territorial disputes. With Malaysia, I think it can help maybe to promote a better cooperation and better coordination in the South China Sea. And actually it has been promoted by Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping. I think it was last October when he came to Singapore and to Indonesia, and to promote the idea of a new maritime Silk Road, a kind of an era of cooperation in the South China Sea among the different countries. But I think that's a very special tragedy. Won't change anything on the territorial dispute.
And as you said in part one of our discussion, though, the verbal jousting that we're seeing right now, that'll pass.
It's verbal because China has to show, actually, its public opinion that the government is doing everything it can, actually, to defend its citizens. That the whole idea of China is going out. China do have like overseas citizens, and China has a duty to protect them. And that actually, in a way, the legitimacy of the regime and of the government to be able to protect its citizens.
All right, according to one Associated Press report, the race is definitely on to find the ship. National prestige at stake, particularly for China, which wants to show, as you were saying, Antoine, its growing maritime presence. With more Chinese traveling abroad than ever, 100 million last year, more than double the figure for 2009. They're increasingly reliant on their government to assist and protect them when overseas, and they're looking for proof that it can fulfill its role. So far, again, Beijing hasn't found the airplane, and in fact, instead, it gave information which turned out to be a wrong lead.
That's true, but in the same time, at least China showed that actually they do have some capacities, at least some satellites, at least to take some photograph of the sea, and at least they have shown themselves trying to do everything they could to help the Malaysian authorities.
And is that also a reaction to last year? China got a lot of flack for not helping out when there were those terrible floods in Southeast Asia.
It is in a way. It is in a way also, but it's quite different because in this tragedy you have more than 130 Chinese citizens involved. So it's completely different, I think.
Is China going to try to, again, the U.S. has ships that are not far in the area. Is China going to try to play the same role that the U.S. is playing?
Yeah, actually, it's kind of the non-military cooperation and not like fighting cooperation. China has been actually sending some vessels, some military aircrafts to the region. You do have today some vessels actually in the Indian Oceans. That's a way that, in a way, China can show that it has like kind of growing capacities, maritime capacities. Will it change something? Will it help actually the investigation? That's the big question. And it would be actually a big plus, of course, for the Chinese government if they could give like some very important evidence.
So, Jim Matthews, when there's an investigation like this one, as we said, what is it? Was it you were saying there were several dozen, more than a dozen different countries? This sort of race to find the airplane going on. Is it a big battle of egos?
It sounds like it's starting to shape up that way. My guess is that the search crews themselves, everyone's very professional. Everyone sees themselves as just looking for the target. And the rivalries happen at the echelons 2 or 3 levels above. But yes, certainly there's national prestige on the line. There's looking to prove that they have a legitimate expeditionary navy. There's all kinds of rivalries that are going to play themselves out at the higher levels. Among individual air crews, there's always going to be competition, even in the same service. hey, I'm the guy who found it. My crew is the one that found it. But at that level, it's more of a friendly rivalry that drives everyone to try to find the missing aircraft. I think that once you get into the geopolitics of it, that's when you start looking at echelons above the searchers.
And the rivalry, Jim Matthews, is not just between national navies. It's also between media. We hear that in the United States, for the first time in a long while, CNN has beaten Fox in the ratings by covering this story day and night. What's your feeling on the media coverage?
We could do another program on that. I'm sort of fascinated by it. I think it's interesting when you look at a story that, putting my journalist hat back on, we have really nothing to say and have not had something to say really until the satellite breakthrough earlier this week. And yet countless hours have been filled with speculation, and it's become kind of silly at times. I mean, we've talked about black holes, and we've talked about aliens, and just incredible nonsense that's been used to fill the airwaves instead of concentrating on the real tragedy that's taken place, which is that hundreds of people appear to have lost their lives in the ocean. And there's an international effort trying to find them. That's a story in and of itself, but we don't have definitive answers, and the 24-hour news cycle abhors a vacuum.
The Malaysians, Jim CLEMES, have been having a daily press briefing. They've been criticized for giving clumsy information, not giving enough information. How do you handle publicity on something like this?
Well, I'm not a communications expert, but clearly the first thing, as I said earlier, they need to inspire confidence, and they have to inspire confidence in all of the actors, the other countries, but with the families. And that means making it clear that what they're telling them is transparent. They're giving them the information that they can. It's truthful. They're not holding anything back, and that the information that they're giving has been verified. And if they do that, then they'll at least gain the confidence of the families and of the other countries and be able to continue properly. And I think I'd just like to make a point that about the press coverage. I think there's arguably too much press coverage at the moment, but there's going to be not enough press coverage 6 months down the road. And what's inevitably going to happen here, unless they find something fairly quickly, but given the precedent of Air France's flight, I suspect it's going to be a very difficult search. And at some point, the media interest will flag, and at some point, the governments, and in particular Malaysia, may want to stop searching as well because it's costing too much money and it's just a distraction from the rest of life that they want to get on with. And that's where the families are going to have to play a role, which we did in the Air France flight, to continue the pressure and to try to get media coverage as well to keep the search going on, because otherwise the government's going to try to just impose their own kind of analysis, which for the Malaysians at the moment seems to be suicide, that they keep bringing out. They'll put on their own explanation for what happened, given their own political needs, and that'll be the end of the story. And the families need to organize themselves and work against that.
And as Antoine was saying, the difficulty here is that most of the families, 2/3 of them, are not in Malaysia, they're in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And what's also striking is that Malaysia Airlines has been actually trying its best to help the families. And I think we don't talk about that much. It looks like the Chinese relatives are like alone in a hotel waiting for any news. Malaysia Airlines actually has been helping them to get to the hotel. It's up to 5 relatives for one passenger. Now Malaysia Airlines is actually providing to give them money. I know it's not a lot, but at least they are trying to do something. It's not like if they were not doing anything. Then, of course, we can understand the anger of the Chinese relative, which has been expressed today in front of the Malaysian embassy. But we should not forget that it's a tragedy and that it's very difficult even for the Malaysian Airlines and even more for the Malaysian authorities to help the Chinese citizens.
All right. We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you very much, Antoine BONDAZ. I want to thank John CLEMES for being with us. Also want to thank Pierre DUVAL and Jim Matthews for joining us from Washington. Stay with us. Much more to come at the top of the hour. You're watching France 24.